Hello everyone. So today I will be going through the standard level content of the topic of reproduction as part of the IB biology curriculum. So just before we get started, I will not be mentioning the menstrual cycle in this video, and that is because I have a separate video on it, just because in my opinion, it's a little difficult, so I just wanted to put all of the attention into one video. So if you just want to review the menstrual cycle, but not anything else in reproduction, feel free to just watch that video. But yeah, that's why you will not find menstrual cycle in this video. But I will link the menstrual cycle in this video as well, so you know where to go. So let's get started. Essentially, there's two different types of reproduction that we need to learn in the IB, and that's asexual and sexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is the production of genetically identical offspring from one parent, examples of that being binary fission, budding, or mitosis. And sexual reproduction is the production of genetically different offspring through the process of the fusion of the two nuclei of two gametes to form a zygote, which is essentially fertilization. The fusion of the two nuclei is fertilization. Now, for asexual reproduction, I think it's good to know different types of asexual reproduction, but we don't need to go into depth for standard level. Higher level, I'm unsure, I have to check. But there is two types of sexual reproduction that we need to know, and that is human reproduction, and then also human reproduction, and then also plant reproduction. So let's get started with human reproduction first, because it is a little shorter, I think, without the menstrual cycle, of course. So first thing I want to do is go over the two gametes, which, by the way, gametes are sex cells. And in humans, those are the sperm and the egg. So let's look at the structures of them. So the sperm, I would say we need to learn 4 different sections. And that is this tip over here called the acrosome. And the acrosomes contain hydrolytic enzymes, which are important in fertilization. Then you've got the nucleus, which obviously contains all the DNA. Then you've got this middle part, which is called the midpiece, which is very appropriate. And the midpiece contains mitochondria. And this allows, obviously, for the sperm to respire. And then finally we have the tail, or the flagella. And this is used for locomotion, or essentially movement, to be able to move forward. Now, that's it for the sperm. Now we can move on to the egg, which there are slightly more components to. This top thing is called the first polar body. Now, for standard level, we don't need to know what it is. I think it's good to learn just in case you need to label a diagram or anything like that. But essentially this disintegrates and it really doesn't have a function. In higher level, you'll understand more of like what it is. Then we've got the follicle cells. And this is to provide nutrients to the developing fertilized egg. So once the egg is fertilized, the follicle cells will give a little bit of nutrients to it. Then we've got this ring called the zona pellucida, and this will be important to prevent polyspermy. And essentially what polyspermy is when multiple sperm fertilize an egg, and obviously usually you don't want that. So the zona pellucida plays a role in making sure that only one sperm fertilizes the egg. Then you've got these little dots, which are called cortical, forgot what they were called there for a second, cortical granules, which are involved in the cortical reaction, which I will explain what that is later. Then you've got the nucleus over here, which again contains the DNA and the chromosomes. And then we've got the cell membrane, which serves as any other cell membrane. But what these have around them are protein receptors. And what these receptors do is they detect when a sperm has made contact with the egg. And then something I didn't label here, but is important to mention, or at least if you get a question, is obviously the cytoplasm. And this is also going to provide nutrients for the embryo to grow. So there you go. That is the structure of the two gametes. Now we can move on to the actual process of fertilization. And I like to do that in 6 different steps. So even before the sperm has reached the egg, there's this process called capacitation. And what capacitation does is, or what capacitation is, I should say, is the egg sends out chemicals and then the sperm are essentially activated in quotation marks. And what this activation does is it makes the sperm more prepared for the fertilization process. So then we've got the second one, which is contact. And this is just the sperm making contact with the egg and going through the follicle cells and then making contact specifically with the zona pellucida. Once it reaches the zona pellucida, the acrosome will release the hydrolytic enzymes, and those enzymes will digest the zona pellucida. And this will make the sperm be able to travel through to the cell membrane. So what happens next is that the sperm and the egg cell membrane, they fuse. So both of the membranes fuse. And this is important because the egg will recept, like through the protein receptors, that there has already been a sperm that has made contact with it. So what it does is this will trigger the cortical granules to undergo the cortical granules undergo the cortical reaction, and this causes the zona pellucida to harden. And this is important because once the zona pellucida hardens, all the sperm that might be eating through it with their hydrolytic enzymes, any other sperm that are doing that will get trapped in it, and other sperm that have just arrived at the egg can't travel through it anymore. So polyspermy is prevented. So that's how that does. Then what happens is that the midpiece and the tail and the membrane of the sperm will disintegrate essentially, and then the pronuclei, which is essentially the DNA of the egg and the sperm, and the singular of that, by the way, is the pronucleus. They will join and undergo mitosis. So, and that's how you then develop the zygote. Yeah, that's it for human reproduction. Now we move on to plant reproduction, which is easier in my opinion, but there's a lot more to learn. So it's just a lot more memorizing. So flowering plants, most flowering plants, interestingly, have both male and female parts. And these are those parts. Let's start with the female part. This is the female part. And the female part is called the pistil. And the pistil is made up of the stigma. And the stigma, what that does is it catches pollen grains. Then you've got the style and the ovary, which contains the ovules. So the style essentially is just a tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. And then the ovary is essentially holds the ovules. Then you've got the male part, which is called the stamen. And the stamen is made up of the anther. And the anther is where pollen is produced. And then the filament, which holds the anther filament. Yes, which holds the anther up. And essentially, the pollen and the ovules are the gametes in plants. Then we've also got the petals, just so I don't forget. The petals, and then the sepal, the sepal. I don't know how, I think you can pronounce it both ways. But yeah, that's it for the diagram. Now, what are the steps of reproduction, essentially? For plants, we don't have to go into a lot more detail in the same way that the human reproduction does. But yeah, so first we have pollination, which is there's two different types. There's self-pollination and there's cross-pollination. And pollination is essentially just pollen being placed onto the stigma. So let's say this flower develops a bunch of pollen on its anther, and then that pollen moves onto the stigma. That is essentially pollination. That would be self-pollination because you're taking pollen from the same flower and putting it on the same stigma. If it was pollen from one flower, which then is transferred to another flower through pollinators or the wind, then that would be cross-pollination because you're taking it from one flower, putting it on the other flower's stigma. So first you have pollination. Then you have the growth of the pollen tube. And essentially for the pollen grain to be able to fertilize the ovary, what it does is it's got cells inside of it, and one of the cells, namely this cell, will grow this pollen tube down the style and then up into the ovaries, as we can see in these diagrams. And then this second cell will divide into two, and it will fertilize the ovary once it's there. So one of the cells is responsible for making the pollen tube, the other divides and then fertilizes the ovary. Now, what's important to know about this is that you don't need to know what this diagram looks like. I don't think you need to anyway. It wasn't shown on our PowerPoints in the way we were taught. But I just think it's easier to recognize what it looks like. I think it's easier to visualize. So you can use this as a visual aid. Just know that you don't have to remember what a pollen grain looks like. So then you've got the pollen tube. And once it reaches there, obviously you've also got fertilization. And again, this is a separate process, but because we don't have to go into detail about it, For me, the pollen tube and fertilization are in the same stage, essentially. Then, once the seed has developed in the ovary, you've got seed dispersal. And as you can see by this diagram, this can go different ways. You've got wind, you've got explosion, which is really cool. Like, I encourage you to search up a video where like a plant is dispersing the seed through explosion. But you've also got animals and you've got water. Now, the reason that plants need to do this is because the dispersion allows the plants to migrate. So it'll have a higher chance of survival. Because obviously if it finds soil that it can grow better in or something like that, or just better terrain, then obviously it's going to increase its survival. Or let's say that suddenly there's like a disease that spread on one patch of field. Luckily, the seed has spread, and so the flowers can still, or the plant, I should say, not just flower, the plant can survive. They also rely a lot on animals because plants are immobile. They can't move. So that's why seed dispersal is so important. And then you've got the final stage, which is germination. Now, sorry for the bad handwriting. Now, germination is essentially the growth of a plant from the seed, and there's a few different parts that you need to know. First is what is in the seed, and so the seed is made up of two different parts, and that's the endosperm. And what this endosperm does is it provides nutrients for the seed, for the plant to grow. So provide nutrients for the seed to grow. And then the other part of it is obviously the embryo. So the actual plant that will grow. So once the seed has absorbed some water, it will start to form. And the first thing that it forms is called a radical. And how I like to remember this, the fact that it's a radical, is that usually radical people want some change in, for example, in our society, like people who are very radical, they want some big change, they want to do something extreme. So it's kind of like this seed that's just starting to grow. The first thing that causes a change is called the radical. I don't know, that's how I remember it. And from that, it will start to move downwards because of gravity, and it'll become the root. And so the seed will start to move upwards. And like once it's implanted, it will move upwards. And this first part that you can see is called a hypocotyl. Why did it not register the C? Okay, a hypocotyl. And from there, it just keep growing and growing and growing until it becomes a plant. And that's it for germination. Now, this is all of the steps that we need to know for the actual process of reproduction and like plant growth, I guess. But there's one final thing we need to know for plants is how the plants avoid self-pollination and promote cross-pollination. And this is important because the more the plant self-pollinates, the less genetic variation there is. And obviously, this can lead to the plant not being able to adapt to its environment because it's not changing its genetic code. So generally, plants want to avoid self-pollinating and want to allow for more cross-pollination. So how does it do that? Well, first of all, you've got pollinators. So let's take a bee, for example. A bee will come to the first flower and it'll try to take the nectar. And in that process, the pollen grains will stick to it. And once the bee moves from that flower to the next flower to get the other pollen, those pollen grains will be deposited on the stigma. And then the bee will get some pollen from this flower, and those will get stuck onto that one. And then when it moves on to this to the next flower, it'll repeat the process. It'll deposit the pollen grain or some pollen grains from the other flowers and then pick up new pollen from that flower. And so the cycle continues. And so that allows for more cross-pollination. The method which is more to avoid self-pollination is maturation periods. Sorry. Let's say this is flower number 1 and this is flower number 2. Essentially what I mean by maturation process is when the stigma and the pollen of one flower mature. And obviously they both need to be mature at the same time for the fertilization to happen, because the pollen grain needs to be mature and the stigma needs to be mature so that the pollen tube can even grow. So let's say in the flower number 1, the stigma matures at around this time, but the pollen matures at around this time. That means that stigma and that pollen cannot create a pollen tube together, which means that the pollen grain cannot, or the cell cannot reach the ovary and then fertilize the ovules. However, let's say on flower 2, the pollen matures at around this time and the stigma matures at around this time. Now you've got 2 periods in which flower 1 and flower 2 can procreate, right? Because the stigma and the pollen will be mature at the same time. So that's how it kind of avoids self-pollination and also promotes cross-pollination as well. And the final thing that I found really interesting that promotes cross-pollination, or again, more so avoids self-pollination, is the fact that some flowers have only female or only male parts. So for example, in this peach flower, it has only the anther and filaments, or the stigma style and the ovary with the ovules in it. So these can be found on the same plant, like for example squash and cucumber. The flowers will be on the same plant. It's just that each of the flowers are either male or female. And so obviously because the anther and the stigma are further away, that means that the chances of self-pollination are decreased, or there is literally, it's just a female or just a male plant. So there's 2 different variations, I guess, of that plant, and one of them is a male plant and the other is a female plant. And obviously that's going to help a lot with self-pollination, because the stigma and the anther aren't even on the same plant. They're on 2 different plants. But yeah, that is it for the whole topic of reproduction. I hope this helped a lot, or at least some. And as always, I will leave the whiteboard in the description and you can check that out. But yeah, I hope this was useful to you. Thanks for watching.